Hello and welcome back to the Grand Unified Theory Principle. This is the last installment. Hopefully I can get it all in 20 minutes. First I want to cover how the universe re-enters the metaphysical state, and then we'll take a quick look at black holes, and after that we'll get back to the actual Grand Unified Theory principles. Now if we look at this here as a two-dimensional representation of the material property state where all the universes exist, and this being the state margins of the absolute vacuums that exist far beyond our ability to determine, as our overall visible or observable universe is going to be very tiny. All of the galaxies that exist at the state margin as an entire sphere produce a geodesic attraction incline that supersedes the gravitational inclines between all of the other galaxies within the meat of the matter. As that occurs, they actually shrink these vacuums, and it starts very slowly as the influence has a very small disparity of greater value over the overall latent cohesion that is the gravity principle of my theory. As these absolute vacuums shrink, the material state universe expands, and due to the cohesion between all of the matter, the galaxies in the heart of the universe drift apart, whereas the ones at the state margin actually start to get closer together. And it isn't until they start to converge on this position here, after billions and billions of years of star activity progressing hydrogen into helium, as the hydrogen index of the universe drops sharply, the number of yellow stars that can support life are so scant that chances are there will be very little opportunity for life to exist at the imminent calamitous point where all of the galaxies, the myriad of galaxies that converge on this point, would be in the billions. And by the time they reach that point, most of them would have sucked up all of their energy into the black holes that exist within them, which are just babies at this point. Even the mega massive ones that we have detected are still just babies. Once they converge on that point, the epic impact forces that are hit and miss in certain terms, but due to the immense gravitational influence of all these black holes, they are drawn to each other, and any that overshoot are quickly halted and reversed and pulled back into that apex position, where the incredibly mega massive black hole that forms there has the power to crush these quantums down to a size so small that quantum relative zero point in space that I mentioned in the very first segment is so small that when these quantums are crushed down to that size, below that size, they can no longer maintain their angular momentum, and they disband in a surge of kinetic energy, pure kinetic energy that is so slight in its overall trajectory terms. Individual lines of force would be so infinitesimal due to the very small energy value of each quantum involved. But once it starts, it's a cascade sequence that causes that black hole to essentially crush itself to death by producing pure kinetic energy to surge out in all directions from each position, as the galaxies that existed here would still be converging upon those positions. So it's a very calamitous and lengthy process where the pure kinetic energy supersedes all of the influences of matter. Once that has completely undergone its transformation from material state properties back to pure kinetic energy, the universe has re-entered the metaphysical state. And it takes a long time for the kinetic energies to essentially disperse and diffuse throughout all of space. With regards to black holes, the assertion I keep hearing is that they no longer have material properties and that they've been sucked down to a one-dimensional point and they no longer have the conventional state, which I find completely erroneous. Because they exhibit gravity, they still have material properties and they still are matter. They're comprised of matter. And essentially, when a star goes supernova, now I also hear that assertion of when a core gets dense enough and massive enough, it'll collapse in under its own mass, irregardless of the state of the star in its lifespan, which is, I find, also erroneous, as the state of compression and decompression values that exist in stars, especially red giants, it always exists. If you were to look at the hydrogen shell with the helium shell above it or outside of it and the core within, essentially it does this. With the exterior of the red giant showing very little heaving, you probably need very good laser interferometry to detect this. But the hydrogen shell within is always compressing and decompressing, and the core is doing the same thing. And that state of compression and decompression precludes any opportunity to achieve the crush values to disintegrate atoms down to quarks, quarks down to electrons, and electrons down to quantums. So this is a very basic rendering of a black hole with its exterior surface. And due to the absolute need for quantums in their interaction to always exhibit absolute symmetry, that's congruity with all of their internal kinetic inclines, they absolutely must achieve absolute symmetry within the black hole body itself. It's actually a gravitational body of matter, not a hole. It's not a well. Essentially, as a star goes nova and the outer helium shell disperses, the sharp drop in mass index causes the core to swell, compressing the hydrogen, giving it inertia to cast off. And when the core has enough mass, its internal cohesion will stop the expansion, and if the expansion is enough to eliminate all of the disparities between compression and decompression, when it starts to compress again, all of the forces line up directly inwards and crush values are achieved. And once the quantums emerge, they start to form an incredibly high energy jumble at the center of this crush progression. And around that jumble of high energy quantums, the quantums start to form the parallel with the quantum entanglement, where they all start to stack up and form piles that run in the millions or billions of quantums from the anterior surface to the exterior surface, where the quantums existing at the anterior surface will have been crushed down slightly, and the quantums existing at the surface would be forced to expand to allow for the divergence involved in the spherical structure. As it continues to draw mass in, quantums Now this is a surface view of the black hole in a very small area, somewhere in the electron size. I mean, these quantums don't swell that much at the surface, and they don't crush that much either. As it gains more mass, it compresses here, and this gets smaller slightly, and the compression is greater. And once it reaches a certain threshold, any mass impact of matter being drawn in will cause quantums to pop off of that anterior surface and join this high energy jumble. And once one goes, the whole surface of one layer of quantums will instantly pop off with it. Once this high energy jumble that absolutely cannot achieve absolute symmetry in its state, but does its best to maintain the greatest symmetry it can, once it gets enough energy in its exertion, it actually causes the whole black hole, or the whole gravitational body, to heave, where a rift will form between certain stacks of quantums, producing the swelled quantums that really want to shrink down to their neutral size to instantly slip into any fissure that emerges in that heaving, instantly filling it with stacks of quantums, restabilizing the entire body so that it can continue to exist for billions of years. Okay, so here we have the cohesion principles for the metaphysical state of energy. That's pure kinetic energy. And here you see the general relativity cohesion to states hierarchy of energy states. Now, this is the angular momentum that achieves matter, and the latent cohesion that exists between all separate states of kinetic energy that exist as matter, at the bottom of all of the typical force inclines of kinetic energy. And here we have the very base energy state, which I term the static state. And here we have the conducted state, which is essentially the energy range that atoms typically tend to exist in, as far as the electrons that exist in direct association with them, and of course electricity, electronics. And at the very top we have the streaming state, which includes the electromagnetic spectrum. And it is the extreme velocity alone that produces all of the wavelengths within the electromagnetic spectrum to not exhibit any positive or negative forces. When the particles, I assert, they are all electrons. Well, the electrons we know and love, negatrons, essentially, is my assertion. And essentially what happens is, as static state electrons migrate through the ground, well, the earth, right? Because ground is essentially the deficiency region. So sometimes the altosphere is ground because there's a deficiency of electrons in the altosphere, and the earth is rife with electrons. And once the strands of molecular oxygen produce a conduit, there's a release because of the low ohmage involved, the low resistance. So this energy state here essentially accounts for the resistance between these two. And these angle lines essentially just go to denote the parallel between the energy value required to bring water from frozen to liquid state, it being equal to the energy value required to raise the ice or water 1 degree. The cohesion to states principle accounts for surface tension variance, where a fluid state body exhibits the lattice lines, the latent cohesion between all of the molecules involved, but at the state margin, the molecules essentially lock arms, and the fluid state molecules do not interact or exchange with the surface tension molecules. They essentially become locked in until an external force causes a rift. The same is true for the footage of astronauts with a big undulating glob of tang floating. Well, the reason it wants to stay as one glob is not solely the surface tension, but the overall latent cohesion that produces the surface tension. So it's more of a conjunction. The variance between the troposphere, altosphere, and the stratosphere and the ionosphere all exhibit same state margins, and they all exhibit cohesion to states, making that state margin very narrow. There's also the refraction of light principle, where light always refracts the same when it interacts with the same matter. So iron will always look the same, silver will always look silver, until it tarnishes, of course, and gold will always appear gold due to its properties. When light interacts with it, it's property based, and it will always refract and reflect the same way. There's also the time dilation assertion made by Einstein with regards to space travelers traveling at the speed of light, experiencing time at a different rate than people back on the home planet. Well, that is actually dependent on the acceleration rate to light speed. The faster one accelerates to light speed, the harder it is for atoms and their associated electrons to maintain their orbital status. As that proton accelerates, those electrons want to start doing this, because they can't go faster and slower and fast and maintain, so they orient this way, and then as the proton starts to accelerate even more, all of the electrons start to trail it. That produces a state variance in the conventional chemistry of matter at the atomic and molecular scale that interrupts the conventional flow of time, and astronauts in that kind of a situation would essentially go through the entire travel period of acceleration like this, where if the acceleration is slow enough that the electrons can maintain their orbital status as the whole vessel accelerates to light speed, a stasis bubble of time will form that will allow the passengers on the vessel to experience the entire timeline and age conventionally, so that by the time they return, as long as they always observe that slow acceleration to light speed, they will age the same as people back on Earth. And just to close off, the reason the universe exhibits positive and negative forces when there is only kinetic and potential energy is because of the disparity between the mass index of the proton and the electron, and the sine wave influence or inclines that have an attraction to each other due to the great symmetry that they can achieve in their interaction, where a neutron is the opposite sine wave incline of a proton, which would be like the same incline that the electron has, So like an electron interacting with another electron, they don't achieve symmetry, so they are essentially repulsed, but due to the mass of a neutron, it's determined to be a neutral. And that's pretty much in conclusion. Thank you for tolerating the incredible timeline involved, and I hope to win something.